Good morning, everyone. Thank you all so much for joining our February 2025. This is our first Coffee and Quality for 2025. So thank you all. If you are new to Coffee and Quality, welcome. We are so glad you found us. And if you are returning, if this is, your 20th Coffee and Quality, welcome back. We're so glad to see you again. So thank you all so much. Today we have a very special presentation by a very special friend of United Way, Daniel Potter. He is the director of Houston Population Research Center. And today we're going to focus on considerations for using population and sample data to learn about your nonprofit organization. So we're going to take these two concepts and bring them into the nonprofit world. That's what we do here at United Way's Coffee and Quality. So I'm so glad you joined us today. So before we get too deep and hand the floor over to Dan, we are going to just set some ground rules. So for our folks who have been to Coffee and Quality before, you know how this quarterly session kind of rolls. Just a reminder, we have a couple of group norms that we hold close to us when we're in this space together. There are ground rules, if you will. So this is definitely a safe space to share and learn. Everyone comes here with a different perspective, with a different mission that you represent. And so we want to bring those in together because we can all learn and grow in this space of data evaluation and continuous quality improvement. With that, please have an open mind and open heart. You might hear something that is new to you, or hear something that is a refresher to you, or hear something that maybe challenges you of, oh, I never considered that, or oh, that's not what I thought that meant. And so please have an open mind as an open heart as you dialogue with each other, speak with each other, and then also hear from our presenter today. Please participate and share your knowledge and experience. This one kind of just wraps up and shares that we are all here in this together. And as always, it's not an invitation. It's an invitation, not an obligation to share, but we do want you to share. Please know that we want to hear from you, whether that's in the chat or just coming off on mute and sharing aloud. We want to hear that voice. So if you have not already, please help us warm up the chat. Please share your name and agency. Would love to know who's all joining us today. If we haven't met before, my name is Jessica Davison. I'm the Senior Director here at United Way in our Mission and Strategy Department. Two more things before I hand it over to Dan. We have these quarterly sessions, but we also have a Teams channel where we share resources, different trainings, different articles throughout the months, throughout the days, throughout the weeks, just as they come to us. And so we share those on our Coffee and Quality Teams channel. So if you're not on this Teams channel, no worries. You're welcome. You can come into this. And so please put your email in the chat and we will add you. Easy peasy to that. My other commercial that I'm going to stand here for just a moment on is that right now, if you didn't know, which I'm sure all of you did know, we have our 2025 Data Practices Survey open. And so it's open now until next week on Thursday, February 13th, it will close. And so this survey is your opportunity to share about your individual experience using data and evaluation within your nonprofit work, as well as reflect on your organization's data and evaluation practices. And so we would love to hear from you as an individual. And if you feel comfortable sharing about your organization, we would love to hear that as well. Everyone is invited to participate in this survey because everyone has a space and interacts with data. And so we want to hear your voice. Please, if you haven't already, take your phone out, scan the QR code so you can take that survey, or I drop the link, open that up in another browser and take it. We really want to hear from everyone. That we have such a diverse nonprofit sector and we want to hear from everyone. So that's my plug on the data practice survey. I will remind you a couple of times to do this. And if you have done it, please take the opportunity to share it with others. That would also be wonderful. So, all right, I've given you two reminders, kind of set the stage, welcomed you all to Coffee and Quality. And so now I am very excited to hand it over to Daniel Potter. As I mentioned earlier, he is the director of the Houston Population Research Center. That title does not do him justice. He does many things for many organizations across the greater Houston area, really trying to help folks bring data and research into action, into practice, into the community, into whatever it is they're trying to do in their work. And so I'm very happy to hand it over to Dan to get us started on this topic. Thank you, Dan.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that warm introduction, Jessica. So yes, let us get into this. And in the spirit of, let me see here, sharing my screen, I think successfully here.
Looks
Um,
great.
Awesome. So, thank you everybody for joining this morning for this topic and conversation. I'm very excited to have this chance to share with you about the ideas of population and sample and where we get data from those for our organization. And so, to help us get going this morning, I want us to start with a scale. Where are we at this morning? If you want to pop off mute and let me know, and let's talk a little bit about why you might be there. If you're not quite feeling the unmute button yet, totally fine. But where are we at hamster scale wise this morning? We got a variety to choose from, all of them adorable in their own way. Where are we at this morning with our on our hamster scale? I'm seeing some fives. Oh, we're in the wilderness, looking around. I'm liking it. Mixed breakfast, so looking to chow down. I like it. I like it. Oh, okay. A few more fives. We're outside in the beautiful, beautiful grass, sort of looking around. We got some more threes, some coffee and danishes to start the morning. Very nice. We feel, oh, 5 and 3 are running away with this one. Oh, we got a 6. Oh, feeling a little bit behind. I get you. I get you. Number 1, the serene beauty for sure. There's nothing quite like hamsters. Mostly a 1, a little bit of 8. Sometimes you just want to snuggle down in the bedding. I get it. I get it. This is fantastic. Yes, you know, as myself, a lover of cute little hamsters, I have to say, like, it's amazing the different emotions that they can help us convey sometimes. And so, thank you all so much for starting off with a little bit of a hamster scale, seeing where we're at. We're sort of a little bit hungry, a little bit waking up, a little bit out in the wild, sort of, see if we can't bring ourselves in a little bit here. Awesome. Okay. So, here's what we're going to try to take care of today with today's presentation. We're going to start with some discussions around population versus sample. What are these things? Like, on the one hand, I think that we've got some almost certainly general ideas about this. I'm going to try to offer a couple different terminology things to just help us think through this, these different concepts. Next, we're going to slip into this idea of sample size and power analysis. This is for when we are going to move from our population to our sample. How do we know when our sample is large enough? And what are some of the rules of thumb that we should be keeping in mind? Beyond that, sample representativeness. What are some of the things we can do? We go about, we get our sample. How do we know if our samples maybe letting us, gain some insights into our broader population? And then we're going to finish a little bit here with conversations around, in many ways, whatever data you have is powerful, it is valuable, but you're also going to want to make sure that it's being conveyed accurately. So we're going to spend a moment there talking about how, with whatever data we're working with, how do we make sure we're communicating it in an accurate manner? And then finally, finishing on response rates, thinking about increasingly it is difficult to get people to respond to surveys. And so, what is a good response rate when we are trying to hear from folks out there? So here's our agenda. Let's hop into it. So I want to start with sort of just a rule that's easy enough to live by, but oftentimes I would say sort of easier said than done. And so I want to start with the idea that when it is possible, we want to collect data from an individual. And so when it is possible to collect that data from an individual, collect data from that individual. Um, do not give up that opportunity. I think sometimes we get ourselves caught up in a couple of different ways of how do we hear from the right people, and do we need to hear from everyone or not everyone. And I'm just going to start with this premise that if it is possible to get data from an individual, go ahead and collect data from that individual. So that's going to be this behind the scenes sort of thought driving a lot of this conversation. Um, and one of the main reasons for that unwavering rule is that when we think about what we're trying to do, with research, with analysis, with an evaluation, we are always interested in trying to describe something about a population. That might sound a little bit weird, but again, within all of these different contexts that we might come across research, analysis, and evaluation, it is interested in trying to say something about a population. The key to this idea is recognizing that population can mean many different things. A population, and we'll hop into a couple examples here on the next few slides, but I think sometimes we say population and our mind goes to something perhaps as big as the US population, or it might be a little bit smaller, the city of Houston population, or clients we serve population. But the point here being that population can take on a variety of different meanings. And based on the meaning that population has for you and your research and your analysis, your organization, that's going to drive a lot of the decisions that you're going to make about, can I get data from everyone? Because it's just not, sometimes based on the definition of population, it's not always going to be possible to hear from everyone. There are going to be restraints on time. There are going to be restraints on money. There's going to be restraints on just energy. And so when we have a population that exhausts us with regards to time, money, energy, a sample can in many ways present itself as a potential solution. So a lot of different things can be populations. Some populations we can absolutely hear from. Others are not going to necessarily be within our reach to hear from because, again, limits with time, money, energy. And in those cases, samples can be very, very helpful. So let's think about this. What are your populations? Knowing that the term population can have different meanings, question for you all. What might be a population that you and your organization are interested in getting information about? And again, we can get that chat going, or if somebody wants to come off mute, we can talk through that as well.
Sci-Hope is interested in getting information from our student populations, and so we'd be interested in hearing about tips for surveying youth.
Yeah, so we got this population of people being served through Sci-Hope. It looks like we've got some folks in the chat talking about graduates of a vocational training program. There's folks that are involved in youth juvenile justice diversion or criminal activity stuff. How do we look at them? Community members has been lifted up as a group. Again, challenges about the youth. Youth seems to be a popular one here. People that are participating in community programming. So again, as you're thinking about this, some of these some of these populations, such as youth and after school programs, that your organization might be serving, we can already start to think about, those might be populations that you're in a position to get that information from each of these individuals. Alternatively, if you're thinking about things like community members, or you're thinking about things where you might be serving thousands of people with a food bank program or other types of services, it could become increasingly difficult. And so this is where we want to recognize that flexibility where some populations we can target to get information from all of them. Others, we are going to want to start to think about, do we need to get that information from all of them? Or might a sample be a potential solution for us to be able to hear from them without necessarily losing out on quality information about them? And so these are just some very generic rules, examples of when it might be helpful to think about, yes, I can collect population data on individuals, and when might a sample be helpful? And so some examples where a population could be, data could be collected on a population would be if you were serving 50 youth in an after-school program. Those 50 youth you have access to, you could be able to talk with them, collect information from them reasonably without, hopefully exhausting things like time, money, energy. If you have 200 families who might be visiting your food pantry, that might be a reasonable sample. I'm sorry. reasonable population with which to gather data, not necessarily needing a sample. If you want to talk to your volunteers, and in particular, you're thinking, we've got 30 people that are just committed to this organization. I wonder why that is. Well, those 30 people, again, this can be a lift that might allow for that data to be collected from all of these different individuals, from the population, in this case, the population being quote unquote repeat volunteers. If you're thinking about frontline financial coaches, again, if you had 100 of them, reaching out to them, collecting data from them. And while these first examples don't have a ton in terms of, like, if you think about the number of people, that it's not entirely driven by the number so much as thinking about the access that you might have to those people. So again, if you've got 300 adults in a vocational training program, that's a lot of people, but you're likely to have access to them relatively easily. Same thing if you have 1,000 older adults that are getting rental aid. Again, that's a large number of people, but these are folks that are likely relatively easy to get a hold of to be able to get some information from them about, again, a variety of different things that you might be interested in. And we'll talk a little bit about when the type of data that really lends itself towards a population versus a sample. But these are the types of, again, if we think about them as populations, where going after each and every single one of these individuals can be a really great way to make sure you're getting robust information and data about, again, your population of interest. Shifting gears, we can think about, well, when might samples be helpful? And again, here we want to call out, we do see immediately off the bat, there's larger populations involved here. So if your organization has served 10,000 clients for financial aid, is it possible to get data from 10,000 people? Absolutely, but that's a lot of people to get data from. And so that may be an opportunity where a sample might allow for you to get the relevant information you're after. Similarly, 500 young people in a college transition program. So here, and this is very intentional, the 500 is a relatively small number, and again, kind of falls within what we see over here for the population one. So why is it in a sample? Well, here, when we're talking about adults in a college transition program, and in many ways, these may be young adults that you are looking to move into college that's going to take them away from an area. It's putting them into a setting that's going to make them harder to reach down the line. In which case, again, while you may start from the premise of I'd love to hear from all of them, it may be that at the end of the day, that energy and effort piece is a little too high for that group. And so is it possible to go through and draw a slightly smaller sample of these individuals to try to get at some of the information? Again, we see large samples, 2,000 expectant mothers, 5,000 one-time volunteers, these types of numbers where it is still within the realm of possibility to try to get information from them, but we're moving into that space where a sample could increasingly be helpful there. So we're using this word sample. We've sort of already talked about a definition. It's the group of, total group of people you're interested, total group of units you're interested in talking about. So what is a sample? Well, a sample is a selection of units from that larger population. And it is drawn with the goal of being able to describe something about the population. And this last piece is really critical. When you're pulling a sample, it's not just about, oh, I've got 1,000 youth that I serve, I'm just going to talk to 100 of them. I really am aiming to, if we're using a sample, I'm really aiming to get that sample to say something about, to describe something about this larger population. And so the way in which a sample is created is really going to influence how confidently we will be able to describe that population there. And so again, this last piece, we want to be able to describe the population. And so how our sample is created is going to really drive that. And I want to introduce 4 ways in which samples can get created. These 4 different ways are convenient sampling, quota sampling, simple random sampling, and stratified random sampling. When we're talking about convenient sampling, this is, as the name suggests, a sample that is created with who's around and it's easy to access. And so an example I oftentimes offer people is if we thought about, I want to know about the community around my nonprofit that we serve. One idea might be running to the grocery store on the weekend and just talking to the first 100 people through the door. The closest grocery store to me is a Kroger, so that's where Kroger gets this plug. They are not affiliated or endorsing this. But I love to offer them as an example because we can sort of really easily grasp this idea of setting up a table in front of the Kroger, and the first 100 people through the door, you're asking them a couple questions, asking them to fill out a quick survey, perhaps. When we do this type of sample collection, it is very quick. It is often very cheap. Again, it's first 100 people through that you can get to answer to your survey. Awesome. The cons to this is that it is very unlikely to produce insights about this broader population. And in some ways, we can kind of think through why that might be. If we're thinking about, again, I'm going to say it's a Saturday morning. I'm at the Kroger. I'm talking to the first 100 people. I get to talk to me. Who are these individuals likely to be? But then we can also think about who may be missing from this sample that's also in my community. This convenient sample might be a little bit older. They may be a little bit more well off. There's a variety of different characteristics of the people that might show up there first thing in the morning on the weekend for groceries, relative to, again, this sort of more complete population of the community in which my nonprofit is serving. So we've got these pros. It's quick, it's cheap. But if we think back to what are we trying to do with our sample, ideally what we are doing with our sample is using it to say something about this broader population. All of a sudden, this convenient sampling kind of falls a little bit short from our goals. It's an option, and again, we'll get to this point later. All data are valuable. We just want to make sure that we're, understanding and talking about them correctly. But if our goal is to talk about our population, our convenient sampling is going to leave us in a little bit of a hard place. So a step in the right direction is the idea of quota sampling. So quota sampling is where you want to be able to make your sample look a little bit more like your population. And so you do that by setting quotas on certain observable characteristics. And so again, we can sort of keep our Kroger Saturday morning example in mind here, where rather than just talking to the first 100 people that'll talk to me, instead, what I might do is I might say, well, what I really want to do is I know my community is 25% young adult, 50% middle-aged adult, and 25% older adults. And so I'm going to set that as a quota. I'm going to talk to 100 people. And once I talk to 25 young adults, I'm not going to talk to any more young adults. Once I talk to 50 young adults, I'm not going to talk to any more, 50 middle-aged adults. I'm not going to talk to any more middle-aged adults. And once I talk to 25 older adults, I'm not going to talk to any more older adults. I've set these quotas, and once they're met, I no longer need that person in my sample. Now, the pro here is that these quota samples, are still relatively simple to gather. What you're doing is you're sitting there again. It's people that are easily accessible to you. They're coming into the grocery store there. In addition to that, your sample is beginning to take on the characteristics of this overall population that you are interested in trying to talk about. But the cons here is that just because your sample is resembling your population does not necessarily mean it is representative. And the reason for this is because when we're setting our quotas, we're having to set our quotas on quote unquote observable things, observable characteristics. Now, admittedly, quota sampling can get pretty complex. So there are definitely folks out there that use quotas in a pretty sophisticated way. But some of the theory behind why sampling is so important is that when you're doing probabilistic sampling, not this kind of convenient sampling, but probabilistic sampling, what you are doing is you're creating a sample that is both reflective and representative of your population on observable characteristics as well as unobservable characteristics. And with quota sampling, your unobservable characteristics are just unknown. And so once again, you're sort of beginning to butt up against this limitation that the quota sampling, while it might resemble your population, it is unlikely to produce insights about that broader population. So we've talked about convenience, we've talked about quota sampling. Let's get into some probabilistic sampling, in particular, simple random sampling. Simple random sampling is oftentimes known as the gold standard. Within simple random sampling, what you are doing is you're starting with your sampling frame. And in many ways, your sampling frame is your population. This is the group of individuals, the cases, the units, if we want to talk about it more broadly, that you are interested in knowing about. And what you are doing within the context of a simple random sample is you are assigning the same non-zero probability of selection to everyone in that sample. In other words, each and every single person in your sampling frame has the exact same chance of being selected. And so, for example, we might have a community. This one would be a little bit of a large community, but we could think about different small towns or cities that have 100,000 individuals in them. And you're interested in drawing a sample. And so you might start by saying every single person in my, again, sampling frame, every single person has a 0.01% chance of being selected. And so everybody has the same non-zero probability of being selected into the sample. And what you would end up doing is you would go through and you would start drawing people out of that sample. And so in doing so, you end up producing a sample of about 1,000 people. And because you were using these probabilistic this probabilistic approach, it allows you to now have a sample that, and again, there's a degree to which some of this is in theory. This is not always going to be the case, and we'll talk about checking our data quality here in a second, our sample representativeness here in a second. But in theory, we're starting with a presumption that our sample is now representative of the overall population. So this is oftentimes known as the gold standard, and that's one of the pros for this. It balances your cases on both observed and unobserved characteristics. These are good things. Now, the cons here is that oftentimes simple random sampling can be incredibly expensive. It can take a lot of cases in order to be able to get the sample that you're after. And how do I build that sampling frame in the first place? And in addition to that, while your resulting sample will be telling you about the overall population that you are interested in, if you as an organization might be a little bit more interested or inclined to better understand subgroups, small groups are harder to reach groups within that population, sometimes within the process of doing a simple random sample, because everyone has the same probability of selection. If you are interested in knowing something about a small group, unfortunately, that small group is likely to have small numbers in your sample. And so you could have a sample of 1,000 people, but that group that you might be really interested in, there may be only 20, 30 of them in your sample. And so you've built this enormous sample, this arguably gold standard sample out of your population, but it's not necessarily going to allow you to look at those groups that you might be most interested in. And again, part of the reason for this can be driven by things like the people you're serving, a subgroup that you're interested in different services to be built around. There's a variety of reasons why a subgroup might be of interest. Again, if I really am trying to keep it at this high level total population perspective, simple random sample is going to be your gold standard. But if you are interested in looking at subgroups, our final instance of sampling design here is another option. So stratified random sampling is sort of a hybrid approach between a little bit of quota sampling and probabilistic sampling, because what it is doing is that it starts with the premise that you as a researcher, you as a community organization, you as an individual interested in knowing about this population, but specifically wanting to know something about, again, smaller groups are harder to reach populations. You want to make sure they're in your sample in sufficient numbers to be able to say something about them. And so what a stratified random sample does is it starts by stratifying your sampling frame on the desired characteristic. And so if you are interested in looking at English speakers versus non-English speakers, high school graduates versus non-high school graduates, if you were interested in looking at older adults, people potentially, 70, 75, 80 and above, if you were targeting a specific age group or above, or if you were targeting children, if you were interested in looking for families with very, very young children in them, you could go through this process of narrowing in on your sampling frame, taking those who belong to the group you're interested in and those who do not belong to the group you're interested in, and just starting by dividing the sampling frame among those characteristics. And then within each of those sets of the sampling frame, probabilistically sampling, randomly sampling individuals out of it. What this does is it now allows for you to guarantee that there's going to be a set number of people from, guarantee is a strong word there, it is increasing the likelihood of having a sufficient sample size for each of the desired groups that are there. And so that is the big pro. It creates a sample where your desired groups are included. And this is very nerdy and geeky on the back end, but this is where stuff like sampling weights can be really powerful, because they can be applied in order to adjust data to be able to make that initial sample that might be oversampled. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about, we oversampled on X population. Well, so I need to adjust that oversampling if I want to talk about this broader population. And so sampling weights can come in as a way to do that. Now, a con here is this can also be expensive. Again, you're drawing a large number of people, and before you can go about stratifying your sampling frame, you've got to have the information that you're interested in stratifying on. So for example, if you wanted to be able to look and say, what I want to do is I want to stratify the sampling frame based on US born status. I want to be able to make sure that we're hearing from enough people born outside the US. Do you have that information about everybody in your sampling frame? If you do, then you can stratify your sampling frame on that characteristic and then sample within each of those. If you do not, then that stratification piece, unfortunately, not happening there. And so you start to run up against this challenge where, for any of these small groups you might be interested in studying, you're gonna need to make sure that you've got that information for the entirety of your sampling frame. But if you do, it can be a very powerful way of being able to collect your sample in a probabilistic way, which increases the likelihood of it being representative of your population, while also, excuse me, while also simultaneously ensuring that you have all of your small groups readily available as part of that broader population there. Okay, so we've talked about different sampling methods, and I know there's a lot of detail in there, but wanting to sort of just talk through those different varieties because they do have implications, again, for what can I do with the data. And so let's take a moment and think through this. There are going to be different different ways, because there are many different ways to create the sample, we do want to take a moment to think about what are the data that I want to collect. Because while we now know all of these different ways to go about building a sample, there really are going to be certain times, certain research projects, questions, analyses that your organization might want to answer that could lend itself wonderfully to a sample. And there are going to be other times where that question you want to answer is really going to require hearing from the full population. So sometimes the researchers are going to thrive on samples, others very, very reliant on the population. And so first, let's start with where might a sample be a solid option. If you are interested in the attitudes or the experiences of people who are in your population, you do not need to hear from that full population. So, again, an example that might resonate with some folks here is what percentage of students feel supported by their teacher? And again, you could sort of swap some of these things out, right? What percent of clients felt, they learned something from their financial coach? What percent of older adults felt more energetic because of the health program? The key piece here is we're talking about attitudes, we're talking about experiences. And so when those are the types of indicators that we're interested in looking at, we can use a sample. Samples are very, very powerful in that regard. Now let's switch gears to talk about when might samples not be ideal, and in fact, you are going to want to hear from the full population. There, what we're talking about is evaluation and experimentation. So if you are doing an evaluation of a program that's being offered, if you're running an experiment within your organization to try to understand the mechanisms behind a different program, that is where you are going to want to hear just increasingly from that full population. Who was exposed to the intervention? Who was exposed to the program? How can we track them and follow them to understand what is this intervention? What is this service? What is this program doing? So again, if I'm evaluating or if I'm doing an experiment of some sort, hearing from that full population is ideal. And so an example of what that might look like is, did an information intervention work to improve college applications? So again, though, we can swap this stuff out. And here I'll offer a little distinction. So earlier I offered the example of, did older adults feel more energetic after they did this health program? Like, that's an attitude. I feel more energetic. If I wanted to evaluate that, we can reframe that question to, did participating in the health activity improve the fill in the blank health indicator of older adults? Again, one of them is attitudinal. I feel more energetic. The other one would be something that would be more of again, a biometrics indicator. So there could be things like blood pressure, cortisol, blood glucose levels, depending upon, again, all of that, depending upon what you're targeting with your intervention. What do you think it is doing? What do you think it is changing? But just wanting to call out how something that might sound very subtle, how do I feel more energetic versus am I more energetic, I suppose, is one way of framing that. One of them, an attitudinal survey, I can hear from a sample. The other one is an evaluation. The other one is where I want to try to hear from the full population. All right. Again, a lot of information there, a lot of stuff to digest. And so I want to take a couple seconds to just try to bring this home with a few examples, a few scenarios here. So my first scenario is, and again, for some of you, this might feel like, oh, that's something we do, or other of you, this might be a little bit off base. And so if you want to swap in some words that might make this more relevant for your organization, please feel free to do it. We've got a few different scenarios to talk through here. Scenario, there are 50 youth participating in a juvenile justice diversion program that's run by your organization. In the program, youth are receiving mental health counseling services, peer mentor support, and access to a specialized 24-hour crisis line. After 2 years, you want to know if the program has had a positive influence on the lives of youth. Do you use a population to answer this question or a sample? And again, feel free to come off mute or throw it in the chat. I'm seeing some populations popping up. If anybody's interested in talking through me some of their logic, I would welcome. My initial thoughts are population, but sample, it's 2 years. That could be a challenge. Yeah, so
Yeah,
anybody interested? Oh, hi, Jessica.
hi, Dan. I'll jump in because yeah, you had me there. And I was just with Bindi, like she was fast on the draw of population because I'm like, yes, population. But you said something earlier on that was like the access you have to someone. And I'm like, do we have access to our population 2 years after the fact? I
Yeah.
don't know. And so that 50 feels like, well, 50, like that's bite size. Like, but 2 years down the road, and then also the positive influence aspect, like that's also woven in there. But you got some samples and you got some population. So I just wanted to give you my thinking around that.
No, I appreciate that, because I think what you're doing, Jessica, what I appreciate you sort of talking through is, these are the things that, and again, there are so many details missing from this scenario. So I'll start there. But with the details that are provided, you're pulling out the type of information that you'd want to be thinking through. Are we talking about 1,000 youth? No, we're talking about 50. So it does feel something smaller. And so because it's smaller, some of the questions that could sort of spiral out from that is, well, what would my sample be at that point? Could I actually draw a sample from that small of a group, perhaps? But then you also introduce the trickiness around, yeah, but we're talking about 2 years. That's a long time. Are they involved the whole time? What if they drop out? How do I go about doing this? And so, you know, each of these are the types of details to be pondering through. Um, there's no right or wrong answer. I'll throw that one out, here. The initial thought, and again, I've seen several of folks sort of jumping in this space too, is that because of the number of youth that are involved, starting with the idea of is a population feasible is likely your best bet here. Again, because your number is so small. If you start to look around and you go, I don't know that a population is feasible because of a variety of different reasons, it begins to raise questions about, well, what is it that I might actually be able to say if I can only get a hold of a subset of these individuals? Because again, this is going to be a small number to start with. But it becomes tricky here, right? And so again, the number of youth involved suggests start with that population if possible. If that population is not possible, really sort of pondering why is that? Because whatever sample that you're able to generate is going to be it's going to be tricky to have that sample be representative of your larger population. Let's go to scenario 2. A financial coaching program has served 1,000 adults in the past year. The program involves meeting with a coach one-on-one once a month, participating in a 2-hour asynchronous online class once a week. This is the first time that this program has used the pre-recorded online classes, and you want to know what people think about them. Were they engaging? Did people like them? Did they feel like they learned anything? So with this scenario, do we think that this be a population or a sample? I'm seeing sample for the win here, coming in strong. I'm liking it. Okay. If anyone wants to come off mute and talk a little bit about what's sort of guiding their thought about the sample versus the population. Linda, I like the enthusiasm coming in with the population. Very cool. Oh. Oh my goodness. Okay, in the previous example, what if you have access to some of them? Could you treat it as a sample? So we're already starting to get into a topic we're going to cover here in a little bit, because I think what you all are already starting to to point at is we can have these ideal thoughts and visions. I've got 1,000 adults. Oh, that's a lot of people. And I'm just asking them about their attitudes. What did they think and feel about this new online pre-recorded thing? I'm not trying to demonstrate impact. I'm not evaluating. I'm not experimenting. So sample here, right? Well, on the one hand, you might say, like, yes, very straightforward, but what's the reality here? Are we really going to be able to get a large enough sample to say something about this group? And this leads to our response rate conversation down the road. But then in addition to that, why not just start with everybody? It's 1,000 people. It's not the end of the world if you send, especially if we think about an online survey we might be doing, if we're using SurveyMonkey or Qualtrics or RedCap, I think is another one that's out there. There's a variety of those online survey platforms now. So you've got one of those things. So for me to send it to 1 versus 1,000 is in many ways trivial. Why not just send it to everybody and then you work with who you have? I'm going to put a pin in that for a second, just because I want to kind of finish there. But I love this thinking, right? Like there's this ideal, yes, I've got my population of 1,000 adults and I'm going to draw a sample and my sample is going to tell me all I need. But the reality is there's a lot of trickiness in that process. And so we have our ideal, we have our reality that we're going to have to be dealing with there. Okay, so we're going to hop into scenario 3 here. There are 150 people who donate more than $1,000 to your organization each year, but you never hear from them and they do not seem to otherwise be affiliated with what you're doing. In other words, just sort of people throwing some resources at you, but otherwise kind of off to the side. And so this might lead this question of, well, why are they donating? What's leading them to put $1,000 towards your organization? In this case, are we thinking a population or a sample? Oh, I love the idea of the call. Yep, yep, yep. Linda, you are coming in strong here. Do you mind hopping off mute? Or I'm not trying to call you out. I'm appreciating the feedback here.
Hey there.
Hey, so when you're thinking about the call, what are you thinking about there?
I just think it's a more personal way to reach out. I know I just attended a conference where I could see it starting off with really just thanking them for their donations, acknowledging their support, and saying, hey, we really want to get some insights from our donor base about our programming and attitudes about what we're doing in the community. And so just try to engage them more, since I'm afraid that if they're not really engaging with you already, otherwise they might be hesitant to engage with you at this point.
Mm, gotcha. It's a great reminder, because I think sometimes we go, oh, we'll do just a quick survey, and the detail you can gather through a 10-minute phone call is just so much more than the detail in a 10-minute survey. And so connecting with them on that level can both help to sustain that engagement for sure, as well as offer some additional detail and insights that might just not otherwise be there.
I know I'm seeing some concerns too about like maybe not calling. I know personally I don't love to get calls, and especially if I'm not prepared for them. So I mean, one idea
Hmm.
would be you could even send out a communication initially to see if you could schedule a call. And I love apps like Calendly or things like that, where you could say, hey, do you have 5 minutes just to share some insights, and let them schedule a time to call. That way they're prepared for it. They've um, committed a certain amount to it. So I don't know if you could engage, use some tools like that, but I think that I don't know, just I think the call or having a way to talk to them more would be a better idea than just surveying.
Yeah, no, the Calendly is a very powerful tool, especially, to your point of that cold call can sometimes feel abrupt, and that's definitely not the intention. And so working with them, that if they are interested, to try to put something on the calendar. And I think here I'll throw out an idea that the do you need to hear from a population for this type of a question? Oh, very good point. Oh, Valencia, nice. I got you. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Like identify them and feed them back information, keep them informed about what's going on. Very, very good point.
Well, and
And
I go back to Jessica's point too, that you realistically, you may not be getting feedback from all of them. I doubt that all of them are going to schedule a call, but so in a way it would be a self-selecting sample, but at
yeah,
least you could put it out there. It's a small enough group to maybe get your sample size.
awesome. Very cool. Thank you all for talking with me about this and sharing this through here. All right. Okay, and then our fourth one is, over the last 5 years, your food pantry has served over 10,000 families. As part of the service, you asked families to voluntarily fill out a very short questionnaire that collected information such as zip code, race, ethnicity, age of the householder, preferred language, and cell phone number. When reviewing the data, there is a lot of missingness. A lot. What do we mean by a lot? Well, you only have a cell phone number for 1,000 families. You served 10,000, you have 1,000 families. Do you attempt to go after the full population or a sample? And this one, I will admit, is tricky. Okay, we got a sample, but if it's a voluntary survey, can we really it's missing? Okay, really say info is missing. Got it, got it. Sample. Okay. Oh, you're good, Suzanne. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. Oh yeah, very true. The fact that you've got so much missingness sort of already clues you in that this group may be hesitant to offer up this kind of information, and so um, trying to go after all 1,000 could feel um, aggressive and potentially infringing on some stuff there. And so one of the challenges here is that you have your population of 10,000. But when you attempted, actually use population because it helps us discover target areas. Oh, yep, good point too. Wanting to make sure that the more coverage we have, the more it can help us hone in on where need might exist, for sure. So one of the challenges with this scenario is that you've got 10,000 families as your population. But when you attempted to look into the data to follow up with these individuals, you already noticed that you had 90% missingness. Specifically 90% missingness on the key follow-up variable, that being cell phone. Because of that, your population really has dwindled down to a very select sample in such a way that the type of data that you might be getting from this group, it would be difficult to take any information from these 1,000 families and try to elevate it up to the whole 10,000. And so this might be one of those moments where, sort of reflecting on what is the type of information that you're after? What are you trying to know from this group? And might there be alternative ways of going about getting it? And again, the reason for that is we want to make sure that whatever sample we're working with is going to give us information that could allow for us to say something about a population. And if it can't, again, there is still value there, but we just want to make sure that we're being careful with how we're talking about it. Again, we will venture through there. Okay, so thank you for entertaining those different scenarios. Definitely different key points within there for us to be thinking about and talking through. And so we get to this point as an organization, we're thinking to ourselves, we really want to use a sample. Okay, so we're going to use a sample. How big should it be? How many people do I need to hear from? And so there's sort of two things we can use here to guide this determination. One of them is the 10% rule. And then the second one is power analysis. Let's start with the 10% rule. So the 10% rule is that when drawing a sample from a population to maintain the assumption of independence, so we are really getting into it this morning, everybody. So thank you for hanging in there. What we're talking about here is when you're drawing your sample out of a population, you want each and every single case to be independent of any other case that you are drawing. This goes back to the same non-zero probability that everybody's supposed to have. And so one of the rules that gets put into place is that in order to maintain that assumption of independence, no more than 10% of a population should be drawn included into your sample. This principle, of course, has to be balanced against the need for a sufficiently large sample size to be able to do any type of research or analysis. And so when we think about populations where our sample size N is sample size, when our N is less than 1,000, you're typically going to target a sample size of about 300. That is 30% of your population, just to sort of call out the contradiction here on this own slide. But this is that balance piece. If I've got If I apply the 10% rule here, my sample size is down to 100, and that's where our statistical power and our ability to really detect something is going to be compromised more and more and more. And so you want to make sure that you're getting your sufficiently large sample size, even when you have relatively small populations. So n less than 1,000, targeting sample size of about 300. But if we applied, I'm sorry, so between 1,000 and 10,000, it's a little bit up in the air. Again, finding that balance, what is the right sample size for us to be going after? When we come to having populations of greater than 10,000, and so here we can think about communities that we might serve, we can think about cities, we can think about counties, we can think about, especially depending upon how much many different services our own organization might provide, the ability for us to have an N of greater than 10,000, our own organization might have more than 10,000 clients. Awesome. And so here, you're going to want to limit your maximum sample size to be 10%. So that's your maximum sample size. But if we think about something like the city of Houston, 2.1 million people, if we were saying, okay, so we need a sample of 10%, that is an enormous sample. That can't be right. And in fact, that's not right. What we can do is again, we can recognize that the 10% offers us a ceiling, if you will, on our sample size. But how do we right size? So beyond this rule of thumb, beyond our 10% rule, we can look to power analysis. So power analysis is a statistical method that can be used to determine how big our sample needs to be. And there's 3 pieces of information that we need in order to make that determination. And those pieces of information are population size, desired confidence level, and then finally, tolerable margin of error. What is confidence level? Confidence level is the probability that the true population value being studied falls within the margin of error, or sometimes referred to as the confidence interval. Another way of thinking about this is how reliable do you want your measurement to be? With regards to confidence level, the higher your value, the more confident you are that the true, and true can almost always need quotes around it, but forgive the boldness to use such a word there, but the higher the value, the higher your confidence level, the more confident you are that the true value exists within this range. Again, the confidence interval. This also, to get a higher value, a higher confidence level, means you're going to need a larger sample size. Where confidence level is coming from is again at the bottom of the page here, a little nerding out here, but each time a sample is drawn, it's expected to be a little different from any other hypothetical sample that could have been drawn from the same population. And so your confidence level indicates the expectation that an estimate from the current sample would be the same as an estimate from another hypothetical sample. And again, you're not going to draw these other samples. This is just in that space of, were you to draw these other samples, how likely is the estimate that you found to be in these other samples? So confidence level, how reliable is your measure? For margin of error or confidence interval, this is sampling error that's built into the measurement. This is oftentimes, if you've seen statistics that are reported as plus or minus, that's what margin of error is referencing. And so how accurate do you want your estimate to be? Ideally, you're aiming for smaller margins of error. And so smaller margins of error means you have a smaller interval around a measurement. The error is being minimized. This sampling error, measurement error is being minimized. For having a smaller margin of error, it's going to require a larger sample size. So if I want my confidence level to go up, I need a larger sample size. If I want my margin of error to go down, I need a larger sample size. And so at the bottom of the page here, just kind of, again, like a general idea, what is this talking about with margin of error? So we want to start with the premise, and again, this is where you do see my quotes around the word true. It is not possible to know true population value from a sample. And so our goal is to have a range of values within which this true value is expected to exist. And the margin of error determines how narrow or wide that range will be. And so again, the goal is to keep our margin of error relatively tight in order to be able to say, look, I don't know what the true value is, but I've got this really tight, narrow range within which I'm expecting it to be. And again, we're going to pair this with confidence levels. So now all of a sudden I can talk about I've got this small range of values and I'm really confident that it exists there. Or I've got a very large range of values and I'm not super confident that it exists there either. So let's talk through confidence level and margin of error in action. And so with scenario 1, we want to draw a sample that has a confidence level set at 70% and a margin of error set at 2%. So in this regards, in this way, our confidence level is actually relatively small or low. Even at 70%, it's relatively low, but our margin of error is really, really tight. So we've got a low confidence level, but a pretty tight margin of error. And so we ask clients in a rental assistance program if the aid had kept them stably housed for at least 6 months. A sample of 400 clients is drawn, and 60%, plus or minus 2%, say they remained stably housed for at least 6 months. What does this mean? Let's translate that over into, so first, confidence level was 70%, margin of error was 2%. And so what this means is that the resulting metric of 60% is that there were 240 out of 400 clients who said that they had been stably housed. And because of the relatively small margin of error that we saw, again, that's our plus or minus 2%, because of the relatively small margin of error that we saw, the true estimate likely fell between 58% and 62%. And again, where are we getting that? That's our 60% plus or minus 2%. However, because the confidence level was so low, 70%, if we had drawn 20 hypothetical samples, and again, this is just sort of trying to interpret for us what does confidence level mean, is we drew one sample, but suppose we had drawn 20 samples, hypothetical samples, from our population of interest. Our confidence level suggests that we would only see the same estimate in 14 of those other samples. And so that's a relatively high number of other samples where we would have seen something different. And so our confidence level is low, even though our metric is relatively tight within the margin of error. So here we see a low confidence level, small confidence, margin of error. Let's look at a second scenario. So here we're going to pump up our confidence level. We draw a sample with a confidence level of 95% and a margin of error of 10%. Okay, so we also increased our margin of error here. So we're working with clients in a refugee settlement program to try and get families incorporated into the Houston area. A sample of 90 families is drawn and asked if they feel like they are part of their community. And 52%, plus or minus 5.2%, say they do feel like they are part of their community. Okay, what does all these numbers mean? Let's look through that. So again, our confidence level, we pumped it up 95%. Our margin of error also grew 10%, plus or minus 10%. And so the resulting metric, and again, in this scenario is 52%, means that in the sample, 47 out of 90 refugee families agreed that they felt like they were part of the community. And so this is, with our margin of error added, what we would say is that we are expecting that the true estimate is somewhere between 46.8% and 57.2%. And where is that coming from? That's going to be our 52% plus or minus 5.2%. The confidence level is at a conventionally high level, 95%. And so if we had drawn 20 hypothetical samples from this population, we would anticipate seeing the estimate for this metric. So again, 52%, something in this ballpark, in 19 out of 20 of those. So over and over and over and over again, we would expect to see this type of an estimate come forward. But because we increased our margin of error to 10%, we're now sort of faced with this scenario where our possible ranges go from anywhere from less than a half, 46.8%, to nearly 6 in 10, 57.2%. And I offer those kind of narrative takeaways to recognize that, again, with this larger margin of error in place, all of a sudden, the way that we talk about the data, the way that we might talk about these outcomes can go from anywhere from, oh, this was, less than half of families were feeling integrated, to, wow, look at the success, nearly 6 in 10. And it all is hinged on this margin of error. So we're getting this far range here. And so one more scenario. Draw a sample, confidence level 95, margin error 2%. An after-school program is working with youth to address chronic absenteeism. A sample of 700 youth is drawn and asked if the program has resulted in them feeling like they want to go to school more. 80% plus or minus 1.6% say they do want to go to school more. What does this mean? Confidence level is 95%. We've gotten our margin of error shrunk again, plus or minus 2%. And so what this is telling us is that the resulting metric of quote unquote 80% means that about 560 out of 700 youth agreed that they felt like they wanted to go to school more, with the true estimate expected to fall between 78.4% and 81.6%. So again, we've got a really nice tight margin of error here as well. The confidence level is once again at that conventionally high level, 95%. So if we drew 20 hypothetical samples, we would expect to see this metric show up in 19 of them. So that's really great confidence level there. And because we have a relatively narrow size for our margin of error, the true interval is small. So isn't this what we want? This is the winner, right? Well, each of these scenarios was all starting from a population of 1,000. And the reason for this was wanting to try to drive home the fact that as you are toggling with confidence level and margin of error, the resulting sample size that you need can vary dramatically. So again, with sample size number 1, 1,000 people were in, for the scenario number 1, 1,000 people were there. We had our confidence level at 70, our margin of error at 2%. The resulting, this is our power analysis, says that we need 404 cases. For number 2, 1,000, and this regards it was the refugee families, 1,000 refugee families, 95% confident, but our margin of error was quite large, and so we needed a much smaller sample. And then finally, number 3, our populations was at 1,000, high confidence level, high margin of error, requires a pretty large sample size, 707. And again, thinking about how in the world do you balance that with something like the 10% rule when you're now collecting 70% of the cases. And so recognizing that these are challenges here. I don't offer here a straightforward answer to this, but I do want to offer some online resources that are out there. There are tons of different calculators to choose from in terms of trying to get at your overall what is the required sample size. The one that was used for the purposes of this presentation was calculator.net. Again, not an endorsement. The QR code here will take you to that website. And so I'm going to keep us going here just in the spirit of time, but we can run this example of a population of 500, a confidence level of 95, a margin of error of 5. We're going to leave the proportion alone here. At the 50%, that's the default that the website has. And if we do that, what we would come away with, and here's a screen grab off of the website. I will very quickly here is this website as well. I had it teed up for, well, we can really fast run it. So we said 95, 5, 50, and our population size of 500. And so all we would need to do here is enter 500. And once we do that, we can hit calculate. And that's where we get our sample size of 218 there. And so again, you can sit here and toggle with these different things. Typically, the 50% gets left alone. It's, sample size can become increasingly complicated. And so leaving the 50% alone is a fair way of going about it. But that the, here you can sit there and see, like, if I had again, if there's 1,000 kids that we're working with in an after-school program, what would be the sample size I would need to get the 95% and the 5%? All of these different ways of going about this. But that's an online calculator available for free that people can use in order to get a rough estimate of what sample they would need for being representative of that population. With power analysis, you are typically talking about how big of a sample do I need to talk about the overall population. If we recall earlier, we've already talked about subgroups, those hard to reach populations. And so power analysis is really not, at least this initial power analysis is not taking into account those different small groups. Power analysis is assuming that small groups exist within the population, but again, it's really intended to create to give you an estimate for the sample size that is needed for your overall estimate. It's not necessarily guaranteeing the accuracy of an estimate for a subgroup. And again, by subgroup, we can talk about men and women, race and ethnic groups, grade levels, zip codes, all of these different things and more that you might be interested in understanding about the population that you're serving and you're thinking about a sample. If you're trying to get at one of these subgroups, your power analysis may need to be tinkered with a little bit. And so if you are just interested in the overall estimate, again, you know that there are subgroups, but really what you want to talk about is my overall population, then you're good to go. You really don't need to necessarily spend a ton of time worried about subgroups. However, if you are interested in trying to do between group comparisons, you're going to want to take your baseline power analysis and begin to think about how might I increase it. And this is where power analysis becomes incredibly tricky. And so a couple things to work with here. Again, I'm back to some rules of thumb. If your subgroups are relatively balanced in your population, and so suppose if we wanted to talk about the city of Houston and you were saying, men and women, I want to look at men and women to see about employment opportunities that are available to them. In that regard, you have relatively balanced populations. It's not exactly 50-50, but you're pretty daggone close to it. And so with that in mind, your effective sample size is relatively unchanged from the power analysis that we would just run. In other words, when I've got those balanced groups, your overall tends to be able to handle estimates for the subgroups that are making up that larger population. The more imbalanced that your population becomes, and by imbalanced, what I'm talking about is if you have a population that is 5%, 95%, or sorry, let me start with imbalanced first. Yes, if you've got a population that's 95 and 5, and I know that might feel extreme, but even if it's starting to get into the 25-75 or even the 30-70, your power analysis for the overall sample needed is dwindling in its effectiveness. And so the more imbalanced your groups, the less effective that your power analysis is going to be, a larger sample is needed. Again, I want to emphasize it becomes incredibly computationally complex to get there. And so looking through a couple different things online can offer some very general takeaways about if your groups are imbalanced like this, go ahead and multiply your effective sample size by this amount. Beyond just when you have two groups, if you are adding more than two groups. So again, we talked about thinking about something like men and women, but if you were thinking about something like age, younger, middle-aged, older adults, if you think about race, ethnicity, if you were thinking about all of the different categories that are out there that have more than just two to that group, again, your effective sample size is shrinking. And so as you have more groups that you want to take into consideration, you're going to have a larger sample size. And again, the complexity there is a little bit beyond what we're in a position to talk through here today. And so a couple rules of thumb. So again, I just want to emphasize, more complicated math is involved when subgroups are of interest. Okay. Keep in mind that between group comparisons, so here's if I want to look at men versus women job opportunities. I want to look at outcomes from a vocational training program for people with a high school diploma, people with some college, and people with a bachelor's degree. I want to look at pre-K outcomes for Hispanic, Black, Asian residents, white residents, children. All these different combinations. If these are the types of group comparisons that your organization is interested in making, if your sample size is less than 50, it is going to be very difficult to do comparisons there. Statistics gets real wonky at that point. Ideally, you're at a minimum, you're looking for more than 50. Ideally, you would like each subgroup to have more than 100 within it. And so again, those are my rules of thumb that I can offer. But it's computationally intensive to try to get at the exact right sample size there. But there are a lot of these are the considerations that have to be kept in mind when deciding, is a sample right for the research and analysis that's trying to be conducted? If I'm thinking about all these different groups that I'm trying to look at, is the sample the right idea, or is the population what I need to be aiming at? Okay, we've got ourselves a sample. The question now becomes, is it any good? So sample representativeness. The way a sample is drawn is going to determine whether or not it can be representative of the overall population. But even when probabilistic methods are being used, there's just no guarantee it's going to be representative. Again, I was talking earlier that probabilistic sampling is a theory. It's not a hope. It's more than a hope, but it's a theory that it's deriving a sample that is representative of this broader population. It is not always going to work, unfortunately. And so we want to check that. We want to check the representativeness of our sample, and we do that by comparing the sample to our population on some characteristics that we have for both. And really the question you're trying to boil down to here is, does your sample look like the population it is supposed to represent? And so these can be, again, you can do these based on characteristics that you have about your population as well as your sample. That would be the key thing to be looking for there, because again, you want to make sure you've got comparable characteristics in both of your data sets. Now, if non-probabilistic techniques are being used to create a sample, so what are we talking about there? Convenience sampling, quota sampling, the same type of comparison between sample and population can also be done. And if your sample and population are looking like one another, that can build the confidence that, hey, these data are helping me understand something about perhaps this broader, broader population here. But we don't want to confuse that just because my sample might look a lot like my population, if I've derived it through non-probabilistic techniques, convenience sampling, quota sampling, it still does not mean that the sample is representative. It can look like it, it can be reflective of, it can resemble, but we want to be careful with the word representative. And so finally, thinking about rules of thumb around power analysis and sample size. Sorry, power analysis, rules of thumb, and then our response rates. So what we are talking about with our rules of thumb, about 50 and 100 or 300 people for a population of 1,000, our power analysis is giving us, you need this sample size. It is talking about your analytic sample size. So these are the cases that you would have data for. But we have to keep in mind that getting to that analytic sample can be difficult. Response rates right now have just plummeted from where they used to be even 3 decades ago. And so what do we mean by response rate? Response rate is based on the number of cases in an analytic sample divided by the number of cases that were invited. So if we want to put that as just an example, if you have 200 clients in your analytic sample, but 1,000 clients were invited to participate, then you have a 20% response rate. For nonprofits, the relationship you all have between your organization and the client is extremely important for maintaining and improving response rates. Even so, currently, what is oftentimes considered to be good response rates for customer surveys is somewhere between 5% and 30%. And so if we want to think about what that means, if a power analysis recommend, so if we think about the example of the 500 population that told us we needed 218 for our analytic sample, if we got a response rate of 30, we would have needed 727, which is more than our population. If our response rate was 5%, we would need to somehow come up with 4,360. Again, response rate is a challenge right now. And so facing that, how do we try to, get to our analytic sample size, knowing that it's just going to be very hard to build that, in some ways exhausting the population that we have available to us. It gets even worse if you were trying to collect information from a general population. Within the general population right now, response rates are ranging anywhere from as low as 2% to the highest that is out there right now is about 30%. But that's just, we haven't seen 30% response rates out of the general population in a decade at this point. So power analysis for a community of 20,000 residents. You're talking about, again, if we have, we're targeting 20,000 residents. We've got an analytic sample size of 377. If we had a response rate of 30%, that would mean we would need to recruit 1,257 people. But again, completely unrealistic response rate for the general population. Instead, response rates of 2% is something that's on the low end. But again, to just try to offer what that means, you would need to be recruiting 18,850 people out of this 20,000 person community. So for all intents and purposes, almost everybody. And so response rates are a huge problem right now in regards to trying to build samples. And so finally, I want to try to just like wrap us up here with perhaps thinking through like what might be a realistic experience. And in particular, this idea of it's not really a sample, but it's not the population either. So researchers will oftentimes start out by trying to hear from the population. And we had this conversation a little bit earlier where we serve 200 clients. Let's go ahead and just go after them, right? So you might be a nonprofit. You've got those clients and participating in financial coaching. And so you reach out to 240 of them to get feedback on their experience. You manage to get 140 of them to respond. So right there, your response rate is phenomenal relative to what other people are experiencing right now. But you didn't hear from everybody, and you did not start out by trying to draw a sample. So again, it's not really a sample, it's not really a population, then what is it? Well, in some ways, this can be most easily compared to something of a convenience sample. These are the individuals that you were able to get. Now, given that it is a non-probabilistic method for identifying the cases, it's going to be a really, really good idea to compare the characteristics of your sample with the characteristics of this population that you were looking at. And the reason there is that even though you heard from 140 out of 200 clients, who were the 60 that were missing? If it turns out that 140 looks a lot like your 200, again, you're not necessarily representative, but you've got some good robust data to be able to say something about that population. But if that group of 60 that's missing was a very unique group, all of a sudden your sample, while it's the majority of people you served, may actually not be reflective of the entire population of people that participated. And then to finish on this idea of something we've talked about a couple of times, all data have value. The key is to really make sure that you're talking about them correctly. And so, this sort of boils down to this idea of accurately communicating data and analysis. So we started with this idea, research analysis and evaluation are always interested in describing something about a population, but they don't have to, right? Ideally, again, it's this classic moment of ideally, this is what they're doing. This is what we're setting out for. But at the end of the day, if something goes wrong in our collection, in our analysis, in our representativeness, our reflectiveness, it's not that the data we have just need to be thrown out the window necessarily, but we want to make sure that we're not overstating what they are. And so again, we want them to talk about a population, but they don't have to. And so if for a variety of different reasons, you don't have your data able to talk about your population, you can still talk about it. It's just critically important that any findings or results are discussed and described as accurately as possible. And so a couple of examples here. We had this example earlier, 200 clients who participated in financial coaching. All 200 are called, data are collected from 140 of them. If you go through and you determine that your sample does not necessarily look like your population, or even if it does, but you want to make sure that you're careful not to overstate what your data are doing, a couple of key things to keep in mind here is sometimes we default into simple talking and writing up of the data. Blank % of clients said the following. Well, we can swap out the word clients with something just as simple with clients who responded to the survey. it is a little bit longer. It's also the accurate description of what's there. In terms of talking about data as representative, again, you might not have that representative data, but you've got data that are reflective. This might feel like semantics, but it's helping to make sure you're signaling to your audience that you understand the data you're talking about. Instead of just saying we heard from 140 clients, presenting, we contacted 200 clients and we heard from 70% of them. Again, recognizing both of these are communicating very similar pieces of information. One of them is offering this transparent, here's how we did this. The other one is offering up, kind of glossing over some of the challenges around the response rate stuff. And then finally, recognizing descriptive versus inferential statistics. Descriptive statistics are about talking through your sample. This is me telling you who's in our sample and what's going on in that sample. And inferential statistics is all about trying to take that sample and say something about a broader population. If what you're trying to do is say, hey, we've served 1,000 clients, we reached out to those 1,000 clients, we heard from 150 of them, here's what they said. That's descriptive, and that's an honest, accurate reflection of the data that you've collected. And while, again, we want that data to be able to say something about that larger population, to infer something about that larger population, we may not be in the position to be able to do that because we didn't quite get the full representativeness of the population that we were interested in. This has been a lot. Yes. So in summary, when it is possible to collect data from an individual, collect data from that individual. We're finishing where we began. Next, not all samples are equal in terms of how well they're able to say something about your population. And to that extent, how a sample is created matters. And that's our convenience, quota, SRS, simple random sampling, and stratified random sampling. Some types of research lend themselves to samples, others do not. Feelings, attitudes, experiences lend themselves to samples. Evaluations and experiments do not. Determining a sample size is easy enough, but it also gets more complicated quickly. Again, we saw earlier, 95% confidence level, 5% margin of error. These are your conventional levels. Super easy to plug my population in there and get a sample size, and it just gets more complex from there very quickly. What we also noticed earlier, though, is depending upon how we're toggling around our different metrics, we can use a relatively small number of cases to say something about a very large population. But we want to make sure that we are keeping subgroups in mind. If I want to compare groups, it's going to make it difficult if I'm trying to say something about each of those groups in particular. No matter how a sample is created, go ahead and compare it to the population. This is our data quality moment. Do my data in my sample look like the population that I'm trying to get it to say something? Even getting a small number of people in your sample can require recruiting a large number of people. This is our response rate reflection. And then finally, discuss data and research accurately above all else. And again, sometimes we might feel like it's undermining the work we've done. It is way better for us to be honest and transparent about the research that's been conducted, rather than being called out in retrospect by somebody who would then potentially undermine the entirety of what has been conducted there. All right. Again, that was a lot. So I think, do we have time for questions? I believe we've exhausted our time together.
We have exhausted our time together. You have given so much information, so many rules of thumb. It was kind of hard for me to keep track of them all, but they were all amazing and great. So thank you. Please, everyone, give Dan a big coffee and quality round of applause. I'm seeing all the reactions, all the emojis. Thank you, thank you, thank you. There was one question that if you have like a minute and folks can stay around, but if not, your feedback is a gift. Please share it. We would love to hear it because this helps us improve. And whoever completes it. I just think it's going to give you good karma. I definitely am not trying to get a population out of here for my little coffee and quality survey. It's just going to give you good karma to do my survey.
That's right.
That is. But Dan, I have a question for you, and it kind of comes from the calculator is like really helpful.
Jessica, sorry, the form,
is,
saying
yeah.
the form doesn't exist.
I'll fix it. Yep.
Okay.
It kind of goes back, and Dan, you gave a calculator on how to calculate
Yep.
these, which is great. Like, let's use that. But in Valencia had a question like, is confidence level based on the number of responses or the number of reporting stability? So if you can kind of go back to that example and like really what's it being based on, just to help them understand the calculator.
The confidence level versus the confidence interval. So I just want to make sure.
Yeah. She
Mhm.
said confidence level.
Confidence level is definitely reflected in the sample size. That the larger your sample size is drawn from a population, the more likely that any other sample drawn from that population is going to look like the estimate that you produced with your sample. And again, those other samples we're talking about are hypothetical. They're not being drawn. It's not that you're producing 100 different samples and then comparing yours to those other 100 samples. It is that sort of theoretical approach there, but that it's driven by, or it is a larger sample is going to increase your confidence level. What was the thing she was comparing that against, though?
I think it was at the time you were describing the number of reporting, like the result that was reported from the folks.
Oh, yeah. No, it's not the number of affirmative cases. If we think about a binary, yes, no, graduated, not graduated, if you're interested in the graduated group, it's not driven by the proportion who graduated. It would be driven by your total number of cases in the group. If you have a rare event, again, that's going to get back into that space where your effective sample size is likely to be diminished there off of a power analysis. But by rare event, we really are talking about something that might be happening 2, 3, 4% of the time. If you have an event that's happening even 10% of the time, it's no longer a rare event, and so you're not necessarily going to be plagued by the same type of sample size challenges.
Thank you. That was kind of one of the questions that came in that I was like, if you got a minute, because I know you've given us a lot. And so thank you so much. Thank you to everybody who listened today. I know folks will watch this, maybe probably watch this again to really get this and bring it back into their organization. So thank you again, Dan, for presenting today at Coffee and Quality. Please join us for our next Coffee and Quality on May 2nd. We're going to continue on this analyzing theme for the first part of the year. And our next one is on using AI to support your data analysis. So please join us for that. And I hope to see you in May. Thank you.